It all started the day I realized I was done being the backup player in my dad's life. See, for years, I had done everything I could to earn his approval. I worked hard, stayed out of trouble, tried to show him that I could handle things on my own, but every time it felt like I was invisible. It wasn't that my dad was a bad person, he was just preoccupied. His world was always revolving around his career, his friends, or whatever new interest he had. And I was just there in the background, waiting for my moment. But that moment never seemed to come. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough. I'd score high marks, hit some personal goals, and even make big decisions that impacted our family. But my dad? He'd nod, maybe throw out a quick compliment, and then move on to something else. I could never understand it. Why wasn't he proud of me? Why didn't he see how hard I was trying to prove myself? He always had an excuse. I'm busy right now, or we'll talk about it later. But later never came. One day I thought I had figured it out. I decided to do something big, something that would make him see me, something that would force him to acknowledge that I wasn't just some kid lingering in the background anymore. It was the kind of move that anyone would be proud of, and I thought for sure it would finally get me the recognition I craved. But I was wrong. The day I made my move, I expected a conversation, a "hey, good job" from him, maybe even some praise. Instead, I got nothing. It was like I hadn't done a thing. My dad barely even looked up from his phone when I shared the news. He just went on about his day like I hadn't just made a huge decision that affected the family. And it wasn't just the silence that stung. It was the realization that no matter what I did, I would always be overlooked. He would always find someone else to focus on, someone else to give his attention to. But that's when I realized something else. While I had been busy trying to prove myself to my dad, I had been blind to something that was happening right under my nose. What I discovered shattered everything. It wasn't just about me being ignored. It was about how much my dad had taken from me, how he had played favorites in a way that I hadn't seen. And when I made this discovery, I realized that I had been foolish. All this time I had been bending over backwards trying to get his approval, while the real prize, the real power, was within my grasp. That's when I decided things needed to change. I wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I was done playing the background character in my own story. I was going to take the spotlight, and this time it was going to be on my terms. I always felt like I was living in the background of my dad's life. He was the kind of person who had everything together: his career, his friends, and his social life. Everyone loved him, and rightfully so. He was charming, outgoing, and always seemed to have something going on. People were constantly asking for his opinion, and he never hesitated to share it, whether it was about politics, family matters, or the best way to fix a leaky faucet. He was a go-to guy, the one everyone turned to. But then there was me. I was his kid, but I often felt like I was invisible. It wasn't that he didn't care about me, it was just that his world seemed so much bigger than mine. He never really showed it, but I could tell he was always more invested in everyone else. I remember thinking, I'll just keep working hard, and eventually he'll see me. He'll realize that I'm worth his time. It wasn't like I wasn't achieving things, though. I was a good student, held down part-time jobs, participated in family activities, and helped around the house. I thought I was doing everything right, things that should earn me at least a pat on the back, maybe even a little praise. But no matter how much I did, it never felt like enough. Every time I reached a milestone, he was too busy to care. It was like his attention was always somewhere else. One of the first times I really felt this was when I was in high school. I'd spent months preparing for a huge academic competition. It was one of those things that could really open doors, something that could give me a chance to stand out and make my dad proud. I poured everything I had into it, studying late into the night, rehearsing my presentation over and over, tweaking every detail until it was perfect. It was a lot of work, but I knew that if I could just nail this, my dad would finally notice me. When the day arrived, I gave my presentation in front of a panel of judges, and I nailed it. I was ecstatic. I didn't win first place, but I was still incredibly proud of myself. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment he's going to notice. So when I got home, I couldn't wait to tell him. I remember walking into the living room and seeing my dad lounging in his favorite chair, flipping through a magazine. I stood there for a moment, waiting for him to ask how it went, to show some sort of excitement for me. But he didn't even look up. "Dad, I did it," I said. "I competed in the academic contest today and I did really well." He glanced up briefly, gave me a nod, and said, "That's great, kiddo," before returning to his magazine. I was stunned. It felt like someone had ripped the floor out from under me. I'd just put in months of hard work, and all I got was a half-hearted acknowledgement. My excitement fizzled, and I walked away, not knowing whether to be hurt or just confused. But that wasn't the last time it happened. Over the years, I achieved more things, graduated with honors, got an internship at a top company, and even started climbing the career ladder. Every time my dad was too busy to care. It wasn't that he didn't love me, I could tell that he did, but there was always this wall between us, something I couldn't quite break through. It was like his attention was always on something or someone else. His focus was never on me, and it became so painfully obvious. And I started to notice something else. It wasn't just his indifference that hurt. It was the way he treated others. Whenever my dad was around his friends, they'd always get his full attention. He'd engage with them in meaningful conversations, ask about their lives, their successes, and even offer advice when needed. But when it came to me, the conversation would be short, and he'd quickly turn back to whatever else was occupying his mind. I was always second place in his world, and I was starting to feel it deep down. One thing I'll never forget is the way he would always go on about his friends' accomplishments. He had a close friend, Mark, who had a similar career to mine. And I remember one day, Mark came over to our house and was talking about some project he had been working on. My dad was absolutely enthralled, hanging on every word. I don't think I'd ever seen him more interested in something someone was saying. The next day, he mentioned Mark's project to me as if I should be impressed, even though I had been working on something much bigger at the time. It was this constant cycle. My dad would be so involved in other people's lives, but when it came to me, it was like I was just a passing thought. I kept trying harder, thinking that maybe if I proved my worth enough, he'd finally see me. But as time went on, I realized I was chasing a shadow. I was trying to get attention from someone who was too focused on everyone else to even notice what I was doing. It was during this time that I began to change. I realized I was spending too much time trying to earn his love, and not enough time learning to love myself for who I was. But there was still this bitterness, this quiet resentment built up in me as I watched my dad continue to pour all his energy into other people while I stood by, unnoticed. I began to see that I wasn't just fighting for his approval, I was fighting for something deeper. I wasn't just looking for recognition anymore. I was looking for respect, for validation. And I knew if I kept going down this path, I was never going to get it from him. That's when everything clicked for me. I wasn't going to spend my life chasing after my dad's approval. Instead, I decided to take control of my own narrative. But that wasn't all. There was something else I discovered. Something that pushed me over the edge and made me realize that my dad wasn't just ignoring me. He was actively preventing me from taking control of my own life. The moment I made up my mind to stop chasing my dad's approval, I thought things would get better. But in reality, they only got worse. The more I focused on my own life, the more I began to realize just how much my dad had been taking me for granted. I wasn't just an afterthought in his eyes. I was a pawn in his life, ignored until it was convenient for him. I started looking at things differently. I noticed the way he was constantly wrapped up in his own world, always busy with his career or his hobbies. But when it came to me, his own child, he didn't even try to understand what I was going through. He never asked about my work, my personal struggles, or my accomplishments. He never seemed interested. And that's when I realized that everything I had done up until that point, every favor, every sacrifice, every hard-won achievement, had never been acknowledged. But I wasn't just going to sit there and be a doormat anymore. If I couldn't get his attention with hard work and respect, maybe I could get it with something else. The truth. I started paying attention to the little things, his actions, his decisions, the things he said to other people, and it didn't take long to see a pattern. There was one particular incident that stood out, one moment when everything clicked into place. It all began when my dad casually mentioned that he was planning a big family gathering. He was always so focused on keeping up appearances, hosting lavish events where people could see him as the life of the party, the successful, well-connected guy. He invited everyone, his friends, his colleagues, even some distant relatives who hadn't been around in years. I was, of course, invited, but it was clear that I was more of an afterthought on the guest list. It was the same old routine. The people my dad found impressive, the ones who could further his reputation, were always at the top of the list. That day, as I sat through the gathering, I found myself getting more and more frustrated. There were people there who had been out of his life for years, yet my dad was showering them with attention. He was the same old charmer, laughing with them, telling stories and offering advice. But when it came to me, he barely even acknowledged my presence. It wasn't just that he ignored me, it was the fact that everyone else around him could do no wrong in his eyes. He made a point of praising their accomplishments and even asking me about my work, only to then turn the conversation back to something or someone else. That was when it hit me. For all these years, I had been living in the shadow of his ego. He didn't care about me the way I wanted him to. He cared about his image, his reputation, and how he was perceived by others. I wasn't a part of that equation. I was just the kid who was there when things got tough, the one who was good for a few chores or a helping hand, but not much else. The turning point came a few weeks after that party. I overheard a conversation between my dad and one of his friends that made me realize how little he actually valued me. I had been sitting in the living room trying to focus on something when I heard him on the phone in the next room. At first, it seemed like a typical chat about business, but then I heard him say something that made my blood run cold. "We've got to make sure the kid doesn't mess things up this time. We can't afford to have any more setbacks." It was a casual comment, but the way he said it made it clear he didn't think I could handle anything on my own. The kid he was referring to was me, of course, his own child, whom he had always tried to mold into someone he could use or control. It was in that moment that I knew my dad didn't respect me. He never had. And if he ever did, he had buried it under his own selfishness and desire for control. I was done. I wasn't going to play the role of the obedient child anymore. I wasn't going to be the one who worked hard and got nothing in return. I started quietly gathering information. I checked my dad's financial records, something I had never dared to do before, and what I found shocked me. There were so many things he had hidden from me over the years. Financial investments, property deals, and even assets he had made without informing me. I was his only child, and yet I had been kept completely out of the loop. One thing that stood out was a property that was in his name, but it wasn't just his. It was a piece of land that had been in our family for generations, and I knew that once my dad was gone, it was supposed to pass down to me. But I found out that he had made some shady deals involving that land, and it was no longer in my name. Not only was he trying to control my future, but he had also worked behind my back to secure things for himself, leaving me with nothing. This was the moment I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. It wasn't enough to simply walk away from him emotionally. It was time to show him who was really in control of my life. I wasn't just going to let him get away with this. I had the power now, and I was going to use it. I began laying the groundwork for my revenge. I knew that if I exposed the truth, his financial secrets, the deals he had made without my knowledge, I would be able to take back what was rightfully mine. It wouldn't just be about taking control of my future, it would be about taking control of the narrative in our family. But what I didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate. As I began to dig deeper, I realized my dad had been making these moves for a long time, and I wasn't the only one who had been affected by his decisions. His closest friends, the people he had trusted with his secrets, were in on it too. The deeper I dug, the more it became clear that my revenge wasn't just about exposing my dad's betrayal. It was about destroying the web of lies he had been weaving for years. And once I had everything in place, it would all come crashing down. The day of reckoning finally arrived, and everything I'd worked for, every decision I'd made, was about to come to fruition. I had all the evidence I needed to bring my dad's carefully constructed life of lies and control crashing down. I had waited for this moment for so long, and now I was ready to expose everything. I had already told my dad I wanted to talk. He didn't think much of it. Maybe he thought I was just going to complain about some small thing again, or maybe he had convinced himself that I was just another one of those people he could dismiss. But this time, I wasn't backing down. This time, he wouldn't be able to ignore me. When I walked into his office that morning, the tension in the air was palpable. He looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the look on my face. I could see the confusion in his eyes. He knew something was coming, but I don't think he had any idea how deep it went. "I need to talk to you about the property," I said, keeping my voice steady. He shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. "What about it?" I pulled out the stack of documents I had gathered over the last few weeks, everything from financial records to property deals, and slammed them down on the desk in front of him. His eyes widened as he looked at the pages, flipping through them quickly, a slight tremor in his hand. He knew exactly what I was holding, the truth. "You've been making deals behind my back," I continued, my voice growing louder with each word. "This isn't just about the land. It's about everything. You've been hiding money, making decisions, and keeping me in the dark for years. You've been manipulating me, controlling my future, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." He tried to hide his panic, but it was clear he was rattled. For the first time in my life, I saw him look at me like I wasn't just a kid anymore. I wasn't the background character in his story. I was the one holding the power now. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he spat, his voice shaky. "You don't have any idea what you're talking about. This is my business, my life. I did what I had to do to protect you." "Protect me?" I laughed bitterly. "You didn't protect me. You used me. You ignored me for years, and now you've been keeping me from what's mine. You kept me in the dark, thinking I'd never figure it out, that I'd just keep playing the fool while you took everything." He stood up suddenly, his face reddening with anger. "You're making a mistake. You don't know how hard I've worked to build everything. I did what I thought was best." "Best for who?" I shot back, standing my ground. "Best for you or best for me? You've never cared about what was best for me. You've always cared about what's best for you. I'm done being your puppet. You've been living a lie, and I'm here to pull the curtain back." The room was thick with tension. He took a few steps toward me, his face twisted with frustration. But I didn't flinch. I was no longer afraid of him. I wasn't the kid looking for validation anymore. I was the one with the truth, and I wasn't about to back down. "I've already spoken to the lawyer," I said, as I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out the legal documents. "This is the proof. This is the truth. You can't just make things disappear with your lies anymore." He looked at the papers, his face contorting as he processed the fact that he couldn't talk his way out of this one. His world was falling apart. I could see the realization hit him, and for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. I wasn't just the person he had ignored anymore. I was the one in control. I had the power now. "What's happening here is over," I said, my voice unwavering. "The house, the land, the deals you made, they all come to me now. You've betrayed me, manipulated me, and I'm not letting you get away with it anymore." He opened his mouth, probably to plead with me, but I was done listening. He had no more power over me. I had taken control of my life, and now I was taking control of the narrative. His face paled as he realized just how deep the hole he'd dug was. He knew he had no way out. All the work he'd done to keep me in the dark, to control me, was crumbling around him. There was nothing he could say. There was no excuse he could make. "You'll regret this," he muttered, but it was clear he knew it was over. "No," I replied coldly. "I won't. But you will." I turned and walked out of the room, leaving him there in the wreckage of his own making. I knew he would try to fix things, maybe even attempt to guilt trip me or manipulate me into backing down. But I was done. I had finally taken the power back. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about me taking control of my life, of my future, of my own narrative. As I left the house, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It was over. I had won. And for the first time, I wasn't invisible anymore. The fallout from that day wasn't as dramatic as I expected. My dad, despite all his bluster, didn't make any big attempts to fight back. It was like the life had been drained out of him. The reality of what I had done, what I had exposed, settled in, and he knew there was no turning back. His world of control, the facade he had built, had come crumbling down, and he was powerless to stop it. For a while, I didn't hear from him. There were no phone calls, no angry confrontations, nothing. It was like he just disappeared into his own guilt. He must have thought I'd back down, that I'd feel sorry for him and take pity. But I didn't. I had finally taken back what was mine, and I wasn't going to let him manipulate me again. I focused on myself. For the first time in my life, I started living for me and not for his approval. I began taking control of everything, my career, my relationships, my finances, and more importantly, my sense of self-worth. I no longer looked for validation from my dad or anyone else. I had finally learned that I was enough on my own. A few weeks later, I got a call from my dad. It was short and to the point, but I could hear the tremble in his voice. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone strained. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to feel. A part of me thought I should be happy that he was finally reaching out, but another part of me just felt indifferent. I had finally realized that his approval wasn't something I needed anymore. I agreed to meet him, just to hear him out. I didn't want to be cold, but I also wasn't going to let him back into my life like nothing had happened. I showed up at the coffee shop, and there he was, sitting at a table by the window, looking older, worn down. I hadn't seen him like that before. The power had shifted, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the one waiting for his approval. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "I know I've messed up, and I can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I didn't do it to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you in my own way. I just didn't know how to show it." I could see the sincerity in his eyes, but that didn't change anything. He had still taken from me, manipulated me, and expected me to keep playing the role of the obedient child. But now I wasn't the same person I used to be. I had taken control of my life, and that was something he couldn't take back. "You can't keep controlling everything around you, Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'm not the person you want me to be anymore. I'm not your puppet, and I won't let you drag me back into that life of lies and manipulation." He was silent for a moment, clearly hurt by my words. But I knew he had to hear it. For years, he had controlled everything, how I felt, what I did, and even how I viewed myself. But now, I was free, and I wasn't going to go back. The conversation ended quietly. I didn't feel anger or resentment toward him, but I also didn't feel anything that resembled reconciliation. I had taken back control of my life, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I took the next steps in securing my future. I sold the land, the properties, and everything else I had inherited. I used the money to invest in my own business, something I had dreamed about for years. It wasn't just about the money, it was about finally living for me, on my own terms. And my dad? He faded into the background once again, this time without the power to control me or my decisions. He tried to reach out a few more times, but I never responded. I had moved on. Eventually, I learned that he had made amends with some of his friends, those who had once been a part of his carefully curated world. But it was too late. The damage had been done. I had seen him for who he truly was, and I no longer had the desire to be part of his life. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about liberation. I had taken the spotlight, shown him who I really was, and in the process, I had learned to stand on my own. As for me, I thrived. My business took off, and I finally found the happiness and peace I had been searching for all those years. The satisfaction of knowing I had reclaimed my power, of seeing my dad come to terms with the truth, was the sweetest victory. I wasn't just someone in his story anymore. I was the one writing my own, and I was doing it better than I had ever imagined.